Hello and welcome to PHM 627. And for this class, we'll be discussing trade and health. So we have a couple of learning objectives. The first is going to describe how trade is a determinant of health and describe the relationship between trade liberalization and the emergence and prevalence of non-communicable diseases, and then describe the nodes of the General Agreement on Trade Services from the World Trade Center. And so to get into it, we start by looking at trade as a determinant of health. So this video does a really good job of explaining what trade is and how we moved from countries mainly trading within itself to where we are at right now, where there is a lot of goods and services that are going across borders, and really kind of breaks it down in the sense of how did we go from trade and barter results, doing that with the people that we know, everybody that looks like us, and within borders, to where we are now, where there is a lot of international trading that happens. Watching this video will really help you in situating your mind into why this is an important issue to address. So, we begin with trade is a very critical determinant of public health. The reason being that, especially where we are at now, with a lot of international trading happening, there's so many features of globalization and the impacts of globalization as a result of trade patterns that has influenced the health of people globally. Uh, I'm going to use a very recent example being COVID-19. There's a lot of traffic between China and the rest of the world, and also between the rest of the world and various parts of the world. And that made COVID-19 to be able to spread as quickly and as widely as it did. So that is a way of trying to situate trade as a determinant of health. And so long as there's increase in liberalization of trades, we are always going to have to look at how trade influences both national health as well as global health. And liberalization brought some kind of influence that has to do with employment, in the sense of being able to go across border and get citizens of another country to come in and be paid at a much lower salary or compensation than citizens of that country. And things like nutrition, both having new kind of food items being introduced to a country that may be different from the way that they typically eat. Some may be good and some not so much, but this is all the influence that trade does bring in. And then, of course, you have the environmental factors that comes with industrialization. And the more that a country is being industrialized to be able to meet the trade demands of other places or globally, the more it affects the environment of the country in such a way that may not have been anticipated at the time that it started. And then, of course, there is the thing about social capital. So I've included a link to kind of explain what social capital is. But in a nutshell, what happens when people move from a place where they are to a different place? Usually there is a change in the way that they live. Some of the times they start eating something different from the way that they used to eat. Or once they had a lot of family around them that were able to help in their emotional state, in their social life, and therefore they were able to maybe maintain a certain kind of health. And then they move into a different place where they lose all of that and they have to adopt lifestyles that may not agree with them, and having to lead to a change in the way that they behave. There is a study that was done about immigrants that moved to the US. This study was looking at the US and how their health changed as a result of living in the US. So the first few years that they arrived in the US, the kind of incidences and prevalence of some illnesses and diseases kept changing the longer they stayed in the US. So you may have a degree of, maybe there's a spike in the incidence of a disease, and the longer you're staying, the higher reports of those diseases is showing up in the community. So this is one of the things that come with trade liberalization. So this image kind of is modified from a model that looks at health systems in low and middle income countries, that kind of looks at a economic and policy perspective, trying to understand how trade influences health. So you have economic opening and the cross-border flow, and you have goods, services, capital, people, ideas, information that is flowing. And this is being encouraged or limited by international rules and institutions. So all of this is happening. And then you have the international rules that have direct or indirect impact of the national economy of the places of different nations, and in effect the health related sectors, which then trickles down to the economy of the household, the health sector, to the risk factors, which all boil down to health. So there is a very direct link between health, trade, and health, whereby every decision, well, not every decision, a lot of decisions that is being made, a lot of commercial and trade decisions that are being made, have a knock-on effects on the health of the nations and also globally. So there is this concept called the trickle-down economies. The idea of the trickle-down economies is that there's tax break and benefits are being given to corporations and the wealthy, and this trickles down to everybody else. So we know that this does not work. However, we still have these policies being one of the reasons why you have very big organizations moving from the US and establishing their businesses in elsewhere. I know there is a lot of Subway across the globe. There's McDonald's. It's also, but when I used to live in Lagos, there were a couple of McDonald's that I saw there. There was KFC and all of that. The idea is, by the time big corporations get tax breaks and benefits, they are able to go into the countries and different countries and able to give the people in that country or in that society a way to earn more money. This is the idea. That's not quite how it works out in reality. You can read the article here that looks at trickle down economy to kind of understand a bit more. So the global health system is characterized by import-export business, in which rich countries export the ideology of Western scientific medicine, and aid is predicated on the ideology, on this ideology to poor countries. So in return, the poor countries export a portion of their previously limited pool of talented healthcare workers back to the rich countries. So this is what you have with the critical shortage of healthcare workers. However, what is happening is that for many, especially countries in the global north, they are attracting a lot of healthcare workers in the global south who get trained usually at a subsidized education, and then they say all you need to come here to do is take an exam. Once you pass the exam, then you can start working in the US. When you compare someone who has been trained in a different country, they don't come into the US with thousands and thousands of student debts, because they've been trained by their country and they're just coming to kind of start working, which is very attractive to people who are coming from those countries, because they get to have opportunities in their careers. However, this comes at the cost of the countries that they are coming from, because for every healthcare worker that migrates to a country in the global north, the country is losing those workers. And we do have this thing we talk about, brain drain, whereby the most skilled people are being attracted out of their countries to come to live in the global north. Now, to be able to live in the global north is not, usually when we think about immigrants and migration, there's always that picture that it is people who are running away from bad situations that are coming. In actuality, there is a lot of hurdles when it comes to moving from a global south country to a global north country. You have to, going through the visa process, it's not easy. So the people who get to move through the legal routes have to prove that they are really good. So it's not just anybody that gets to leave to come into in countries, maybe the US and Canada and Britain and stuff like that, because there is a very high entry barrier that is placed so that only those who are going to be beneficial to the country are the ones that make it in, which then means that those who leave behind or are not able to move are those in terms of contribution to the society, the country, their country is missing out on very skilled workers that would have been, working, which then means that the country's likelihood of being at par with the richer countries gets continually limited as a result of the brain drain. So this video looks at World Trade Organization and does look at some of the things that it has been involved in terms of international trade, and just how much the US, the EU has been involved in making policy decisions in how things has been going. I don't know if you guys remember when I had when I talked about being on the table, inclusion, being in the table when conversations about you are being heard. Unfortunately, with the World Trade Organization, there is a lot more people from the global north that are in the decision making, that are in the room when decisions are made, and not so much people from the global south, which means that a lot of the policies that get passed usually has one party being the majority beneficiary of it, and the other party being the one that is bearing a majority burden of those decisions. So you want to kind of look at it in terms of equity when you are looking at trade and health. So we'll talk a little bit more about trade liberalization. So some of the effects that trade has had, especially as it relates to health, has been the impacts it has had on economy. So it's promoting economic growth through specialization, but the specialization is as decided by demand. Right now, the global north are the ones that are detecting what is of value, meaning that there's always an increasing pressure on the countries in the global south to stay relevant by being valuable in being able to offer the goods and services that are in line with the values of the global north. So what that then means that it is promoting economic growth through specialization. And when we say specialization, think specialization from the lens of global north, the things that is of value to them, which means that the countries in the global south will be losing something as a result of making themselves to be globally viable. So trade liberalization is reducing barriers to trade movement. However, like I said, when decisions about trade policies are being made, they are being spearheaded by the US, by the EU. Very few countries from the global south are in the in the room when these decisions are made. So one party is bearing a majority of the burden, while another is bearing a majority of the benefits. So reducing barriers to trade movement, you want to ask yourself, for whom is this barrier being reduced? Because it is at the moment one way. Barriers have been reduced for the global north to moving to the global south. It has not been reciprocal in the other way. The barriers for global south to moving to the global north is still very much in effect and has barely been reduced. So that is still very much in existence to understand, what trade liberalization really means. So so because of this liberalization and very much the lack of equity in it, it has not necessarily led to greater economic growth in the global south, particularly because you are not dealing with an equal situation whereby there is fairness at the core of it. It's not quite happening at this stage. And like I said in the module that looked at the history of global health, a lot of it is still very much stemmed into it, whereby one party has more power than the other, and therefore things are more in line with one party wants compared to what the other party wants. So some of the places that trade liberalization has made impact has been in changing trade revenue structure in terms of tariff for import and total revenue. And so that's where that has happened. So with trade liberalization and how it has impacted NDCs, you have it in terms of tobacco, the use of tobacco. Trade had some influence on people being able to, the introduction of tobacco, especially with the kind of tobacco that is being, in that's generally being sold at the moment, how it moved into countries that were not using that type of tobacco. And this happened as a result of the open border, and that came in and sold a lifestyle to the people in those countries. So there's been a shift in the market share for tobacco. A lot of the countries have enacted a lot of policies, especially in the global north, trying to kind of contain tobacco use. That has not quite happened with a lot of countries in the global south. So you're still having a lot of the tobacco companies moving from the countries with more restrictive policies and going into countries with less restrictive policies, and they're still able to stay in business as a result. So there's been pressure against tobacco control measures, particularly by very rich companies having a lot of influence on the government of particularly the less wealthy countries that don't quite have the power to be able to go against whatever promised revenue that is going to come from the sale of the tobacco. And then you have some challenges regulating tobacco across international trade rule that has still kind of exists. Then you also have trade and alcohol. taxing of alcohol is not the same everywhere. In some countries, is more strictly taxed. In some countries, not quite so much. So that has also made some companies who are who move a majority of their business from those countries with higher taxation into countries that have lower taxation, because they can. So there's also been a regulation on the sale of alcohol. Also, it's not uniform in every place, and therefore that means that if one country is more regulated for the sale, the company can just move its business to a different country, whereby the sale is a little less regulated. And then you have some regulatory ad, advertising that kind of differs. You In some countries or in the EU has very strict advertising regulations that does not exist in other places, and have the same thing happening whereby companies can move to places that are more liberal when it comes to rules and regulations on advertising. So please read up more on trade, food, and agriculture and how it has influenced food supply chain, the shifts in pattern of food trade, risk of overconsumption, particularly of not so healthy meals. And I remember when I was growing up in Nigeria, fast food was something that nobody heard about. When I was young, it wasn't something that existed. People didn't do fast food. People ate cooked food, like you go in your home and you cook, or you go to sort of a restaurant. There's cooking that is happening in the way that fast food doesn't, it's not done. But now, liberalization has had a lot of KFC and McDonald's in the countries everywhere. And then suddenly you're having a change in culture and a shift towards fast food in the way that it had not existed before. So you may have a lot of people buying consuming some food without any conversations about the risk that it poses on one's health, thereby increasing the risk of non-communicable diseases. So, of course, you then have commercial promotion of highly processed food. In countries that have less regulations, it's just indiscriminate. Nobody really pays any attention to those food facts that are put on it. It's just a lot of promotion. So that's one of the ways that trade has influenced. And then we have the toxic substances. There's been a number of countries in the global north, particularly, that are paying poorer countries for them to dump their bio waste there. And they just dump it there. The countries are being paid. Having those hazardous waste there have direct impact on the healthcare of the nationals of the country, but that's just being done, and it's having a knock-on effect on the healthcare. And then, of course, you have the challenge of lack of technical expertise and adequate facility that does come from maybe some of those countries not being technologically advanced, but also the brain drain that happens as a result of their nationals going to move in some countries in the global north. And there's some challenges with lack of adequate protective equipment that are not happening. Those protective equipment are not being shipped along with the hazardous waste, whereby, like I said, one party is bearing the majority of the burden, while another party is bearing the majority of the benefits. So please watch this video that looks at IMF conditionality and the impact that it had on health. And a lot of what was said here really focused on the health of some countries in Africa, but also some countries in Asia. It really talked about how trade especially with loan that happened, made the healthcare of a lot of countries in the global south to get worsened as a result of trying to get them to become how do I say, worthy trading partners. So it's a very interesting video to watch. So, lastly, we're going to talk about the General Agreement on Trade Services. So, this trade agreement is courtesy of the World Trade Organization. So, the trade health nexus is dominated by trade agreements rather than health regulations. So, some of the trade agreements is nobody is looking at the health effects of it. It's more or less capitalism and commerce. How do we make how do we get the most money out of this international relationship, and less about what is the how is this going to affect the health of the people of that country. So trade agreements, it creates a governance for trade and does impact the economy, which subsequently impacts the health of the nationals. And like I said, the World Trade Organization, it is the spearheads this trade agreement. So you can click here to kind of learn more about it. But the World Trade Organization is part of the United Nations, and it's always very important to remember the foundation of global health and how it is not there's not a lot of equity in the governance and in the policy, particularly in the global policy making that happens. And this is, of course, true with the policies that are made out of the World Trade Organization. So also look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and look at the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is not to say that all of these trade partnerships are all insidious and are all bad. There's always good that is coming out of it, but one also needs to look, kind of have a more holistic look at it and try to figure out what are we losing as a result of gaining something. Is really important to kind of have that much larger conversation. So this video looks at what the General Agreement on Trade is. A really good video. I would advise that you look at it. It's really nice. And then these are the GATS notes. We had note 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they all kind of addressing different things. You have the cross-border supply of services in Node 1. You have the consumption abroad, Node 2, commercial presence, Node 3, presence of natural persons, Node 4. So it's very interesting to actually look at this and see it as it regards to, particularly with healthcare, what is going on with healthcare workers, and to how much some of these nodes have contributed to the brain drain that has happened with healthcare workers, especially frontline healthcare workers in the South, in the global South compared to the global North. So the trade does have a couple of priority areas. The Lancet 2009 looked at a couple of priority areas that needs to happen in order to have more equity in the trade as a determinant of health. One of which is that there needs to be stronger evidence that really looks at the connection between trade and health, particularly both the things that may be making it worse or things that may be making it better. There needs to be more evidence and research on it. And then there needs to be foundation for building trade and health agreements, so that our policies are not just focused on trade at the negligence of health. Needing to look at both things and make sure that they are both being adequately addressed. Then there is always a need to assess for the accession of health goals with trade policies. just to make sure that it is at the forefront of trade policies. A lot of this is also going to help when there is more inclusion with decision making with the countries around the globe that are part of global health. So this video just looks at the general agreement on tariffs and trade. Is just an additional information to have on the trade agreement. So this is where we end for today. Do remember to use the Q&A board if you have any questions. Bye.